Hello, everyone. Hi from my side as well. My name is Bennet. I hope you can hear me well. Can I get a thumb up? Okay, I'm trusting, hoping for the best.
I can hear you. The question is, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, Astrid. Thank you. So, my name is Bennet. I'm the Program Director of Respond. Also, a very warm welcome in my name to this event tonight. I'm very happy to be welcoming Astrid to the program today. And Astrid, you're actually zoomed in from Portland, Oregon. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, and I very much enjoyed all the pitches.
Yeah, did you have the opportunity to listen to them all?
Not only did I listen to them all, I tweeted all about them.
Really? Awesome. Thank you.
Doing my part to drive business and attention to them.
Awesome. This is the kind of energy that we're hoping for tonight. Thank you very much. So Astrid, let me briefly introduce you to the audience. Obviously, we spoke beforehand, but just to basically summarize some of the work you did in 3 bullet points is you were the president of a major US American nonprofit organization. You started your own Tech for Good company, and you also started something that is called Zebras Unite, what started just recently actually, and now developed into somewhat of a international movement. And the question I'm asking is, like, what is your drive and what is your motivation that makes you get up in the morning?
Well, thanks first of all for having me, and I'm very grateful we're doing this in English. As you can tell from my name, I am in fact German, but I left Germany 30 years ago. And as Bennett knows, when I open my mouth, I sound like a 16-year-old. So
Sure.
My professional English is much better. Thank you for that. And what gets me up in the morning, I suspect, is very similar to what gets up all the entrepreneurs in your accelerator, right? There is a lived experience that has motivated all of us to become entrepreneurs, to tackle a particular problem in a particular sector, or in my case, tackle a somewhat more complex system-wide problem using technology, using a business approach. And that's been the motivating force for me after 15 years or so in the nonprofit world. Realizing that technology can actually help us collaborate much more effectively towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we created a technology and system design company intended to, it's agnostic, it works across all SDGs, but very much from the perspective of how can we make the delivery of these outcomes more effective. And I continue to be excited by that. And then I don't know if you're asking this question about how that led me to Zebras Unite, but it's a very short jump from creating my own company to creating a movement, as it turns out.
Well, let's take the jump. I suppose what you've been referring to was Sphera, the company, right?
That's right.
And you're still active in Sphera, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm still the co-founder, and we're still very much working on it. And we have and I encourage your audience and your companies to check it out. We're at sphera.world. We have a SaaS platform that basically helps you spin up solution hubs, right? So in this case, somebody like the BMW Foundation that has a network of solution entrepreneurs, would use our product to help curate those solutions, expose them to the world, and facilitate discovery and repurposing of those solutions.
Awesome.
Well, I should have applied to the accelerator, I think.
You should have, but actually, seeing the competition just now, the pitches, it would have been a very close call.
I think so. It would have been hard. These are great companies.
They are. Let's zoom into Zebras Unite, if you wish. So you mentioned already, introducing yourself and your motivation for the work you do, that you work on sort of system-wide failure, and I believe this is also the reason, or the groundwork that Zebras Unite emerged from, right? And I know you started Zebras Unite together with your co-founders Mara, Ania, and Jennifer. And I'd be curious just to know a little bit more about how you arrived at actually a point of creating what is now Zebras Unite.
Well, the short story is that, after liberating myself from the nonprofit world and reinventing myself as a tech for good entrepreneur, I very quickly ran into some challenges with raising capital. And it's all the usual dynamics, raising capital while female, raising capital for a complex product. It's not a simple thing. I sometimes joke, it's not Tinder for dogs. It's not sushi delivery by drone. It's a more complex product. And sort of running into just largely closed doors, combined with the sense that my company has a purpose, right? The purpose is to make the world better. And a lot of the financing that's available for tech companies, venture capital, does not actually line up very well with my purpose. Like when you sit down with a venture capitalist and they want to know, well, how can you get to $1 billion exit in 5 years? It's sort of a little bit counter to the purpose of what we're building and why we're building it. And so that, as it turns out, I was not the only one having that experience. So my co-founders at Zebras Unite had roughly the same experience with their companies at roughly the same time. And two of them, Mara and Jennifer, had written a piece it's called Sex and Startups, which I highly recommend Googling, that sort of drew this analogy between, bodily functions and the venture capital world. And that's how we all met, essentially. Ania and I read it. We all got in touch with each other. We compared notes and we said, oh my goodness, we're not alone. This experience we're having is not unique to us as individuals. It's actually systemic. Yeah. And so that's what prompted us to write the follow-up piece, Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break, which we published in early 2017. And that in turn precipitated, much to our surprise, a global response. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people came out and clapped and reacted on social media and said, I am a zebra, I want to invest in zebras. I thought I was so alone. And we basically found ourselves having to create a global movement.
Okay, awesome. Well, I want to talk more about zebras and what zebras are and what the whole movement is about. But if I understand correctly, the first time that actually the conversation was had about sort of the failure of the ecosystem was at the SOCAP conference in San Francisco, right? And
that's right.
That's curious because the BMW Foundation has been involved in SOCAP for a very long time. I've been there myself last year for the first time. And it's actually a conference where people come together to channel more capital towards development finance and impact investing in the end, right? And it is at such a conference that sort of the spark happened among your co-founders, where the frustration grew so much.
Yeah, what's interesting about SOCAP, and I'm a fan, and I've gone many years, is that it purports to create the social capital markets, and I think it has done a tremendous amount of good, socializing the ideas of impact investing and sort of giving them greater currency. But as an event for investors and entrepreneurs, it's actually very, very frustrating. Right there, if you've been there, you know what it looks like, right? It's this airplane hangar-sized event space where there are 3,000 people, and all trying to meet each other, right? And people are very generous with their time, and it is entirely possible to sit down and meet somebody. But if you're a first-time entrepreneur who goes to SOCAP and you like so many of your companies in the accelerator, you're actually currently raising, it's very difficult to make a meaningful connection. Right, and so while it is doing a great deal of good of field building, events like SOCAP don't actually help create the capital, the community, and the culture that we need. Right? At the end of the day, it's an events company, right? And it's a very successful events company. We'll see how they navigate the transition to virtual this year, but it's not fundamentally a mechanism that solves the practical problems that entrepreneurs have. And so what we did with Zebras Unite, yes, we had an event in 2017, but we actually don't want to do a whole bunch of global events. What we're focusing on is how do we build the capital and community and culture that all of us need in very practical, tangible terms. And that means working with, now 45 chapters all over the world on creating local ecosystems. Incidentally, I took note of the fact that a great deal of, some number of your accelerator cohort are Berlin-based. The Berlin chapter of Zebras Unite is very, very active. It's co-hosted by our friends at the Mozilla Foundation. Coincidentally, they have an event going on right now So that's kind of what we're looking to support, like these local support ecosystems that are peer-to-peer, that help mobilize new capital, that help you build the sort of purposeful corporate culture that you're after, and so support you holistically.
All right. You already mentioned those 3 C's: capital, community, and culture, right? These are sort of the 3 pillars of your work. And let's dive a little bit deeper into those. And what I would like to understand is, obviously, what is the role of Zebras Unite in addressing sort of aspects inside of those 3 pillars? But I'm also curious to hear from your perspective also the market failure that is underlying these 3 different areas.
Well, let's start with the market failure, because it's always nice. It's always fun to make fun of venture capitalists, right? So, as hopefully many of you all know, is venture capital is a tiny, tiny sliver of the global pool or stack of capital that's available to support business and investment in innovation. It's less than 1% of global capital is invested in venture capital, and of that 1%, people who look like me or look like our friend from Nigeria, we get a vanishingly small percentage. Less, women get maybe 2% of venture capital. Black entrepreneurs get less than 1% of what is already a tiny, tiny amount of that particular form of capital. So in the meantime, though, and I noticed this on some of the pitch decks, on some of the slides, the thinking is, like the mainstream thinking is, when you're an entrepreneur, oh, I must find venture capital.
Yeah.
Well, you're already doomed to fail, right? Like the statistics are not good, right? Yes, you may have $1 trillion market, but that's the kinds of products and services that are in your cohort are not well understood by most venture capitalists, right? And so then you go, well, where else can I go? If it's not venture capital, is it bank finance? Well, again, a vanishingly small percentage of entrepreneurs, this is certainly true here in the US, access bank finance. And again, the system is rigged against women and people of color. And so statistically, some 85% of entrepreneurs do not access bank or venture financing. So what that translates into is a massive opportunity for innovating the sources and forms of capital that we make available to entrepreneurs at all different stages of their journey.
Okay, that's understood. I'm just wondering what our startups may think now that they've been pitching how much money they're going to raise, and talking to them over the course of this week now, thinking about introductions to venture capitalists. And perhaps what you're suggesting is like a radical shift of mindset, really, right?
Well, again, I think, venture capital is a fine source of capital if it's right for what you're building, right? But you as a founder, you give up a lot of control, right? When you do the math on serial rounds of dilution, one thing that has always bothered me about it is that you lose control of your company, right? You lose your optionality as a founder, which maybe that's fine for you. Yeah, but what I'm hearing in a lot of the cohort is these are products and services that are profoundly inspired by the lived experience, right? So I don't know, if you're got back, do you really want to sell out to like a big fashion house? Is that really your end goal? Like, you have to ask yourself that, like, what's your exit that you're willing to take? And so I think that's where, like you say, there's an opportunity, I would say. I don't think it's a problem to shift your mind here. I think it's an opportunity to think about sources of financing that are, that preserve your control and ownership as a founder. And also, by the way, a lot of your companies are revenue positive, right? If you have revenue, the best source of growth capital is your customer. Or maybe there are some, strategic partners, sort of corporate venture partners. I think there's some really interesting opportunities, especially if you already have, a pathway to revenue that's identified, where, the classic model of venture capital is all predicated on building a massive monopoly and building your moat and excluding other players. Yeah. With these for-purpose companies, you actually, that may not, like a monopoly may not be the answer. Like, it's nonsensical to talk about a monopoly of removing ocean plastics. You want more companies doing that, not be the only one, right?
Right. You're actually getting into sort of the definition, so to speak, of a zebra, right? And I know from your website and the articles that you mentioned that basically you find or you define differences between the unicorn and the zebra in 4 sort of distinct sections, which are the why, the how, the who, and the what. Mm-hmm. So would you mind walk us through those 4 different buckets?
Well, and I don't know if you have the ability to share your screen. I wasn't going to risk it from my end, but you know, we can pull them up at zebrasunite.com. But it's basically, think of it as a more holistic view of the business. You know, why it exists in the first place, right? If you're solving a problem in any of the markets, like your cohort companies, you likely have a different relationship with your customers, right? You're much more focused on, you know, speaking to the how, like you much more likely, and many of the folks presenting even said it, you're much more likely to think of your customers as community, not as something that you would churn, right? In the VC model. You are much more interested in getting to a sustainable revenue and business model that is profitable, as opposed to growth at all costs, right? And we all have, it's actually helpful to illustrate it with when you think of some sort of standard, you know, classic venture finance companies that have come under scrutiny, like Facebook. You know, what happens there is that, you know, yes, they attract a lot of venture financing before they even have a revenue model, right? And next thing you know, you're extracting, you're mining your customers or the people that you're providing value for. Whereas what I'm hearing among all your companies is, you know, a very clear focus on where revenue is going to come from, and they're not extractive. I mean, there are a handful that talk about advertising models, but even that makes sense in a CSR context. So I think it's just a different mindset in terms of, you know, having a longer trajectory, thinking about your company as something that you may want to be involved with for a long time, as opposed to managing towards an exit. It's about customer success, not customer churn. You know, your customers are your community, not just people who pay you stuff, right? Yeah. And by and large, you care about you know, sort of your larger impacts in the world. You know, and then I think it's a bonus if they're also impactful companies that happen to be solving sort of important problems for the world, as is the case with your cohort.
Right. Okay. I think this is a very inspiring, what you're saying is very inspiring to probably many of the entrepreneurs out there. And I suppose that also many from the founders in our program now will be sort of scratching their heads and wondering, so how to find those opportunities, as you say, in shifting away perhaps from the venture capital focused approach to other sources of capital. And I think one very important element that Zebras Unite is also picking up on is creating that community and also the culture for just establishing a different mindset and a different approach to the whole thing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you need all 3, right? So I sometimes joke. I mean, I come out of the nonprofit world and ran a hybrid company that had both nonprofit and for-profit elements to it. So when I set up my company, I was very well versed in different corporate forms, for example, that were available that I could use to anchor the social purpose, the social mission of Sarah. Well, a lot of founders don't know better, right? And so, so in the US context, for example, I sometimes joke 99 out of 100 corporate lawyers will recommend that you incorporate as a Delaware C company, right? And so, and I don't care if you go for B Corp certification or whatever. As a C Corp, your primary responsibility is to your shareholders, not to your stakeholders. And so that creates, and that's exactly what creates the mechanism for eventually disenfranchising a founder, for example, right? By the 3rd or 4th funding round. And we have heard those stories, you know, from very successful founders who've attracted hundreds of millions of dollars in venture financing, only to then find themselves kicked out by the C or D round. So this is not sour grapes. Like, this is not a story of, oh, well, geez, I couldn't get venture, now I'm angry about venture. It's like, no, you can be a very successful, you know, like middle-aged white guy who's had 15 rounds of venture financing and very, very frustrated with this model. And so in order to find those alternatives, right? So you need to create that's why we're thinking about both the culture change, educating people about these alternatives and popularizing them, making them accessible, but then also building a community around it. So in our online community of over 5,600 people now globally, there are actually investors and lawyers and accountants, right? And some of the people that help you build companies.
Okay. That's a lot of people actually in your online community. When did you start with Zebras Unite? When did you launch?
Well, we wrote the article in the spring of 2017. Okay. We had our first in-person gathering in the fall of 2017, and then we stood up the online community, I want to say, in February of 2018. So we've been at it for 2.5 years.
Awesome. I'm wondering, so in creating this change of mindset and the change of culture and community, what is the role of organizations like ours, like Respond, in actually pushing this agenda ahead?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, on the one hand, there's Respond and your new relatively small cohort of purpose-driven entrepreneurs. So one thing we would love to figure out is how do we, one question I always have for accelerators is where do they go from there? Like, so what happens after they graduate your program, right? And so I think we could have a very fruitful conversation about how we might partner and sort of create almost like a landing, right? Like a home for that cohort of entrepreneurs, and for that matter, others in your networks of responsible leaders, so that there is actually, what's been so rewarding is that people say, I thought I was alone, right? Yeah. And now I realize there are others like me, right? I mean, there are other zebras in Nigeria, for example. There's a whole very active chapter in Berlin, right? So there are actually other people everywhere in the world that are building companies with the same sort of set of principles and mindset like you are. And then, of course, I think as a foundation, as a corporate foundation in particular, I think BMW has some interesting opportunities around sort of amplifying and socializing these themes around alternative pathways to alternative models of capital, alternative ways of building companies. And then, of course, my favorite is always, can you also walk the talk, right? In terms of how you deploy your own assets, in terms of how you show up as partners to these entrepreneurs. And we'd love to talk more about all of that with you.
And we definitely should. We should take this conversation offline and continue it, definitely. Sure. We're approaching actually already the end of the talk. Time flies. I have 2 questions that go hand in hand with each other. Number one is, do you think we are arriving at sort of a tipping point where the sort of mindset starts to spill over and arrive at a mainstream? And if not, or if it's happening too slowly, who do you think the shift, so where do you think the shift is gonna come from? Is it gonna be from the startups, from the investors, from the VCs or the LPs?
So I think, are we approaching a tipping point? I think the combination of the pandemic and the ensuing economic recession, or as I think it'll be a depression, certainly here in the US, and now what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter and the reckoning of how there's systemic injustice baked into all our economic systems. I think that's it's beginning to create that sort of tipping point where people say, oh, we have to do it differently, and we want to do it differently. So I think it's an amazing opportunity to innovate around capital, community, and culture. I think it's going to come from probably a combination of the groups that you mentioned, right? I think it's coming from entrepreneurs who are insisting on building different kinds of companies, and I have I know a partner in a big law firm who says, Astrid, I keep getting these calls from entrepreneurs who want to build hybrid businesses. They want to have a corporate foundation right from the get-go. They want to be a B Corp, and we don't know how to advise them, right? So that to me is an interesting signal that more entrepreneurs are interrogating the assumptions. And then in terms of, I think a lot of the, yes, definitely asset owners, LPs, have a huge role to play here, right? And it's I see our job as Zebras Unite, sort of together with partners, as creating capital instruments that an investor can invest in, right, and feel they're doing something innovative, but also de-risk sort of the perception that, oh well, all these do-gooders are somehow inherently more risky because, God forbid, the telecommunications connection to Nigeria might be a little iffy. So I think there are ways to ease investors into this space. I am least optimistic about VCs driving the change because a lot of VCs are just following a pattern, and they don't actually, I don't think they have thought about their own business model particularly rigorously, and that's a very uncharitable way of saying that.
And that is also a very good word to end the talk with, actually. Our time's up. Astrid, thank you very much for being here tonight, making time for us. And I do certainly hope that the Zebra movement is going to spill over even more to Germany and to more other places and more chapters arising. Thanks again, and giving back to Miki and Hema. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.